This video will show you how to complete exercises 15-12 through 15 using alternate exercises, which means that they will be similar to your exercises, but the numbers will be different. So first we're going to look at this company, and we are going to determine the cost of direct materials used, cost of direct labor used, cost of goods manufactured, and cost of goods sold. Then we will also look at over or under applied overhead. The first 4 items we completed also in chapter 15. So this should be a review for these first 4 items. Then we will also look at something called applied overhead. First, we will look at cost of direct materials used, and that is computed by taking your beginning raw materials inventory, adding the purchases, subtracting the indirect materials, and also subtracting what we have left, so our ending raw materials. So this is similar to what you did in chapter 14, but here we're also subtracting out the indirect materials, because indirect materials is included in factory overhead, not in direct materials. So I've got the numbers computed down here for you. Cost of direct labor is where we will take the total factory payroll and subtract out the indirect labor, because indirect labor also is part of factory overhead, just like indirect materials. So the 177 minus 26.6 means that our direct labor is 150,400. Then we are also looking at something called applied overhead. So in this chapter, we're looking at something called a predetermined overhead rate. And the reason we do this is so that we can go ahead and bill the customer right away as soon as we've finished with the job and not have to wait for all of the actual factory overhead costs to come in. This firm has determined that they want their predetermined overhead rate to be equal to 55% of direct labor cost. We need to know what total direct labor used is, and I computed that number for you here, and then we'll just multiply that by the 55%. So we will apply overhead to work in process for 82,720 in this example. So here are the T accounts, and we'll just start entering the information here. So we have our beginning raw materials, which is listed up here. We have our raw materials purchases. We're going to take out the indirect materials. Now we're going to put into factory overhead those indirect materials. So they are credited out of the raw materials inventory and put into factory overhead. The ending balance here was provided to us. Now, to get the direct materials used, which I showed you the computation on the previous slide, we will put in our ending balance, and then that gives us the direct materials used. Now we'll start putting the information in the work in process. So we had some beginning work in process. The direct materials used are coming over here. So now we're crediting indirect materials went into factory overhead, direct materials goes into work in process, and we have 38,000 left. Now indirect labor is coming down here in factory overhead, just like indirect materials. And direct labor used, which was the 177 minus the indirect. The other overhead cost these are all actual costs that are debited. Then we take out the amount that we applied, and that's going over here into work in process. Then we can add these up and subtract to get our cost of goods manufactured, which we did in the previous slide. Now, finished goods, we're going to start with our beginning finished goods inventory. We will add in here the cost of the goods manufactured, and we will take out the cost of goods sold, because now they're sold, they can't stay in finished goods. So these will be debited to the cost of goods sold and credited out of finished goods. So the last piece we want to look at is the overhead. So these represent the actual cost. So the actual costs come to $97,800. Remember that we applied based at 55%, and that went into work in process. So now we have to see what the balance is. And I showed you here, actual costs are $97,800, applied was $82,720, so that means they're under applied. So they haven't applied enough. So they will have to take care of this with a journal entry to close out the factory overhead account. So they're $15,080 under applied. Now we'll look at the journal entries. So first will be for the materials. When you purchase materials, you debit raw materials inventory, and they paid cash. Next, we want to increase our work in process inventory for the direct materials, which came to $176,400. Then we want to put into factory overhead the indirect materials. Next, we want to look at the journal entries related to labor. So first we'll have direct labor, which also went into work in process inventory, just like direct materials. The credit here is to the factory wages payable, so we can reduce that payable account. And the indirect labor goes into factory overhead just like indirect materials did. And the credit is to the same as the direct labor, factory wages payable. Now we're going to look at the overhead journal entries. So factory overhead is first debited for these other actual overhead costs, and we will credit cash. Then we want to show the amount that we applied into work in process. So remember, that was 55% of direct labor, and the amount applied comes out on the credit side of factory overhead. And then you can see the balance again that shows that this account is under applied. Make sure to use the exercise template that I provided for you in Blackboard, because it includes all of your homework questions and certain check figures. Your last question is an Excel simulation, and before you complete that, you need to make sure that you watch the orientation video and answer the 6 orientation questions, and that will help you to successfully complete your Excel simulation.